Did you know that the key Kabbalistic concept of Partzufim can only be understood with a framework of scientific understanding called emergence? In this explainer, we will introduce the concept of Partzufim, which allows us to relate to everything around us. Please note that all the ideas we will introduce are fully explained with source material in my latest book, Shomer Emunim, The Introduction to Kabbalah. Click on the link in the description below for details about my book. In centuries-old Kabbalistic language, every entity that exists in any world level that we can talk about is called a Partzuf in the singular or Partzufim in the plural. The same is true in our physical world around us. Everything that exists in direct human experience, whether it is an inanimate object, an animal, or an abstract theoretical concept, is a Partzuf. So, what is a Partzuf? The word Partzuf literally means face. When looking at a human face, it contains various components: a forehead, eyes, ears, nose, cheeks, mouth, lips, etc. If these components were to be laid out separately from one another, side by side, they would not be called a face, but rather just a collection of several disconnected and separate body parts. It is only when these components are combined and organized in a specific, sophisticated, integrated configuration that we would call the combined set of components a Partzuf, a face. When we look at a face, we see it as a new entity and as something different to the set of components it is made of. The components, the eyes, nose and mouth, are still all there. However, it is our perspective of them when they are integrated together that allows us to see them differently. Crucially, when we view the set of facial components as a single organized integrated entity, as a face, an extra dimension of information emerges that cannot be related to when viewing a face as a disparate collection of separate parts. Although the separate parts of the face continue to be separately identifiable when we view a face, its composition of separate parts fades completely into the background. We see and interact with the face as a presentation of a person's state of mind, alertness, and consciousness. Every entity and concept in existence can be related to in this way. It can be viewed on the one hand as a whole entity, the larger Partzuf, or on the other hand, as the sum of its parts, the underlying Sefirot. Earlier in this series, in explainer number 3, we used an example of what a piece of paper is made of to introduce the concept of Kabbalistic worlds. The piece of paper can be viewed in different ways and as having different levels. At the lowest level, we might theoretically say it is made up of strings, which are the components of quarks, which in turn are the components of subatomic particles, and then of atoms, and then of molecules, and then the molecules are the components of the highest level in this example, which is the paper itself. Even though these are different views of the same entity, of this same piece of paper, when viewed at each different larger level, properties emerge that don't exist at the lower levels, and most importantly, cannot be predicted from even the deepest knowledge of the lower levels. Each higher level whole is called a higher level Partzuf and is made up of the sum of its lower level parts, which are identical to the whole. The Sefirot and Partzuf terminology is a relative terminology. Each lower level set of separate parts is called Sefirot relative to each higher level Partzuf whole. So the piece of paper is the larger collective Partzuf of the Sefirot molecules. The molecules are the larger collective Partzuf of the Sefirot atoms, and the atoms are the larger collective Partzuf of the Sefirot subatomic particles, and so on. So, to take one example, the piece of paper can be used and interacted with as a humanly accessible information source when writing or drawing on it. At the lower levels, say the level of atoms, it is meaningless to talk about writing on atoms. It is only meaningful to talk about writing or drawing on the larger collective of atoms, the piece of paper. In the same way, we talk about water being wet. However, no one would ever refer to a single water atom as being wet. Being wet is a property of the whole and not of the part. Most importantly, No comprehensive theory of atoms can predict the collective properties of higher levels made from them, and in our examples, no such theory is capable of predicting that a collective of paper atoms will be used for writing humanly accessible information, or that a collective of water atoms would be humanly related to as being wet. It is therefore impossible to predict the properties of chemistry from physics, or biology from chemistry, or psychology or economics from biology. At every higher Partzuf level of interaction, there is an emergence of insight and understanding that simply does not exist and cannot be predicted from each lower level. Therefore, complete knowledge of any relative Sefirot level, of any level of reduction, and ultimately of the fundamental forces of nature, will never predict the properties of any Partzuf built from them. Every aspect of our existence and of life is an emerging ecosystem, a Partzuf, compared to the relative Sefirot, the parts that it contains. At each emerging higher Partzuf level, there is an emerging set of properties and intelligence emerging from the symbiosis, the integration of the lower levels. If we start with inanimate objects, such as minerals and gases, plant life is a higher Partzuf level that not only contains the lower level minerals and gases, but has an emerging higher level of abilities, entities that can grow. The Partzuf of animal life contains a symbiosis of the inanimate and also the plant life, with clear emerging properties, entities that can move around. Then we have the highest level of life that we know of, the Partzuf of human life, which is a symbiosis of all the lower levels of the inanimate, plant life and animal life, with human life being endowed with an incomparable level of intellect compared to the lower levels of existence. Each level of life is a higher level symbiotic ecosystem with an emergence of higher functionality and insight. So, a Partzuf is a particular integrated, organized configuration of underlying component parts, the Sefirot, such that a new level of insight, intellect or information arises when relating to the Partzuf compared to the underlying Sefirot. In the next explainer, we will take a closer look at the Partzufim from the perspective of emergent information. Before you go, don't forget, click on the link in the description below for details about Shomer Emunim, the Introduction to Kabbalah, which contains comprehensive explanations and sources for everything in this explainer series. So, thank you for listening and looking forward to seeing you in explainer number 9.